Towards the end of the production process for Crota's Bane, me and my co-director Daniel were already looking ahead to our next project. Having read The Lore of Destiny quite extensively, we were particularly attached to the story of Dredgen Yor, of Thorn in the Last Word. Much like Crota's Bane, there were lore cards here that gave us an outline of the basic story beats, as well as certain specific scripted scenes. And as soon as Crota's Bane was uploaded, me and Daniel began the process of producing what would eventually become Corruption. The entire process of making Corruption was shorter than the year and a half it took to make Crota's Bane, but it was much more fragmented. We were fraught with arguments and creative disagreements, we had a lot of reshoots and there was a lot of convoluted staging, and there were growing tensions between me and my co-director. The disagreement started with the script. Unlike Crota's Bane, where I wrote the entire script alone, here it was Daniel who wrote the script for Corruption. Like me, he used the Grimoire cards as a basis, but Grimoire can only take you so far. One of the major sources of our disagreements that came up early was the fight scenes. We decided that we needed to include some level of fighting in Corruption to avoid the entire film being just talking without any action. So there are two fight scenes pretty early on in the film, and they're the two most extensive fight scenes in the whole movie. In chronological order, they're Thalor and Holborn. Now, Thalor was canonically killed by Dredgen Yor. This was fine, we decided to stick as close to the Grimoire as possible, and this gave us a kind of easy fight scene to add in. Holborn was more problematic. We decided, for reasons that I can't possibly remember now, that we needed a second fight scene, and we didn't just want to come up with a random guardian for Dredgen Yor to kill, so we went digging through the Grimoire to find suitable named candidates to kill off. I suggested Anna Bray amongst others, and this, along with a couple of lines of script during the Thalor fight, resulted in some fairly harsh disagreements between me and Daniel. Further disagreements were sparked by where the fight scenes would be placed and how they should end. These disagreements seem incredibly stupid and trivial looking back, but at the time it resulted in some animosity and it made the production take a lot longer. In the end, we compromised, and the few lines of dialogue that Daniel really hated were removed from the script, and we settled on Holborn as a target for Dredgen Yor to kill. A lot of the rest of the script was either based off of the Grimoire or was kind of perfunctory exposition, so disagreements elsewhere were quite minor. That being said, by the end of the process, when it came down to editing, me and Daniel were actually working off of slightly different scripts because we had different script formats. I colour code all of my scripts and set them out in what I think is a much nicer and neater format than the industry standard, which Daniel has never liked. This resulted in a bit of a logistical nightmare down the road as I'll go on, but even with a script, or two scripts, piecemeal as they both were, in hand, we could then start to begin our shoot. The first thing we did, and almost as soon as Crota's Bane was uploaded and before we actually started shooting any footage, was to design the outfit, specifically for Dredgen Yor. Now, the character designs for Crota's Bane were assembled quickly and without much thought, mostly working around what our body actors had ready access to, the one exception being Toland, whom I did spend a little bit of time working on. For Corruption, since I would be body acting for Yor, I went to extreme lengths to get the gear that I thought would look the best. Yor had to be clad entirely in black, in keeping with the evil theme, of course, and I didn't really want him to resemble a titan. I wanted to give him a kind of classless look as if he wasn't a guardian anymore, which is why I gave him the starting mark. With regards to the rest of the armour, I wanted a lean figure without too much bulk to it, so I spent a while gathering legendary and rare armour pieces to fit that design. The helmet was definitely the hardest piece to source. It's an old Crucible helmet that I had to spend about 70 silver dust and engrams to get. With Yor's design in place though, we could then begin our shoot. The only major limitation of the machinima format this time around was with regards to Shin Malphur. In the Grimoire, he's supposed to grow from a child to a man over the course of the story, but there are no real playable children in Destiny or even adjustable heights. So our solution was to visually mark Shin's growing up by having him inherit Jaren's cloak, an element which isn't in the grimoire but I think works quite well in the context of the narrative, despite being engineered mostly for aesthetic reasons to differentiate Shin as a child and an adult. Overall, the shoot went much more smoothly than Crota's Bane, and we avoided the deluge of reshoots and pickups that plagued that project. One of the first scenes we shot, if I remember correctly, was the scene where Yor's ghost abandons him, because that was the easiest scene to set up, because it only required one of us. For the rest of the project, however, me and Daniel couldn't just rely on ourselves, so we reached out for some help. Fellow Machinima director Tempest Knight was happy to help with body acting, and in return I was eager to help out body acting with his Machinima series Rift, and later From the Ashes. Much of the project was shot with the help of either Tempest Knight or fellow Machinima director Digital Curse, with a little bit of additional help from a couple of other people. Me and Daniel had specifically scripted corruption so that there were only one or two characters in almost every scene to cut down on the issues we had in Crota's Bane, where each discussion scene needed to be filmed with body actors rotating between different characters because each discussion scene had about 5 people in it. The sole exception to this was the bandit scene, which actually wasn't too difficult to film despite everyone being frequently blown up by Nova bombs. Equally, a lot of scenes were also shot with just me and Daniel. All of Reza Lazir's scenes and a lot of Shin Malphur's scenes towards the middle and the end of the film fall into this category. It is worth noting that the scenes that were shot with just me and Daniel were often more prone to falling under the direction of one of us over the other, since I would always be body acting for Reza or Yor, and Daniel would always be body acting for Shin. In scenes with other body actors, we generally worked together quite well, but when it was just the two of us, the shoot was generally dictated and directed by one person. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it didn't actually cause many disagreements. In contrast, it allowed us some degree of individual creative freedom. The Temple of Crota scene, for example, I was not initially happy with. Since Daniel was directing it, I was relatively happy to just body act and not voice my complaints. On the flip side, the opening scene of Corruption, which is Reza Lazir's monologue, was shot and directed almost entirely by myself, which allowed me the sort of creativity that I needed to kind of pull off some of the more metaphorical and abstract visuals in it. Another thing that smoothed over the shoot and made things much easier was that towards the end of production, around April 2018 or so, Tempest Knight and his body actors set up a Discord server which I joined along with a group of other body actors and directors. This gave us all a sense of community. I had certainly spent a lot of time in that server, and crucially it made body acting much easier because a dedicated channel was set up for scheduling filming sessions. The last couple of scenes were shot quickly and easily, and this gave us a kind of last burst of energy that we needed to finish the shoot. The editing of Corruption was, thank God, less complicated than that of Crota's Bane. We still had no real schedule or checklist, but we were more experienced in dealing with vast swathes of video footage, and I knew not to repeat some of the mistakes I made with Crota's Bane. I made sure that almost every scene was scored, and I double-checked the final project against the script to make sure that all the scenes were in the correct order, and nothing had been left out. The voice lines, though, turned out to be much more of a hassle. Daniel was in charge of casting Corruption and I was in charge of editing. The sole exception to this was Pahanin, where I asked Digital Curse directly if he wanted to voice him, because I'd seen his series, Fireteam Weasel, and I was impressed by his performance of Scully and thought Pahanin could work as something similar. For the rest of the roles though, Daniel had to transfer the lines to me, and often they came in piecemeal or late, which was quite frustrating. I especially struggled with the Dredge and Yor lines, particularly when it came to mixing them. I'd increased the gain until it was just under clipping, but even then it was way too quiet. Unfortunately, because I was inexperienced and at that point had absolutely no qualifications in audio processing, I didn't really know what dynamic range compression was, or that it was the exact fix that I was looking for. This is why a lot of Dredge and Yor's voice lines especially vary significantly in volume, and they sound quite bassy and sometimes slightly overdriven. The voice actor didn't use any compression or process the lines after they've been recorded, and the style of Yor's voice is very loud, quiet, and I wasn't a good enough audio engineer at that point to pick up the slack. I should also point out for the interests of fairness that although it is always helpful to be sent one single audio file with all the lines in the correct order, gain staged appropriately, correctly processed, with no background noise, The ultimate responsibility for making sure that things sound as good as possible lies with the director or the editor, which in both cases is me. So all the subpar mixing and the muddy dialogue is my fault, particularly because I increased the bass on yours voice to make it sound more intimidating, which made the volume issues even worse. Corruption was, on the whole, a much more successful project than Crota's Bane, but in making it, me and Daniel grew increasingly frustrated with each other, and in the end, we never ended up working together again. I don't think of Corruption as compromise though, and without him, I don't think it would have been anywhere near as good. That's not to say there aren't problems, because there are definitely things I would like to change about the project if I could do it again. The middle section of the film is not brilliantly paced and not brilliantly shot either. The two fight scenes, Holborn and Thaler, are overlong and scrappy and not well staged, and most of the dialogue is the same kind of wooden exposition that I wrote in Crota's Bane. But there are things that I love about Corruption as well. The character of Judge Yor fascinated me, which is why I decided to return to him in the first season of Infinity. Riz Lazir's opening monologue, I think, is the closest I've come to perfection in any machinima work I've ever made, because it's essentially visual poetry with the Grimoire voiceover kind of giving a time-lapse dreamy quality to the whole thing. And much like Crota's Bane, the sheer scale of the project and the intensity of the production instills a sense of pride in me despite all of the technical shortcomings. Corruption is one of my most viewed and most liked machinima projects, but in the end that's not what I remember it for. What I remember most is the people that I worked with on it, and I hope that they can be just as proud of it as I am.